Alright, hi class. Today we'll be going through practical 7, question 3. And this is something that is much more difficult and complex, but also very important when you're doing your assignment too. So first thing first, let's understand the question, right? So on your left, you can see create one file, transaction.txt, which contains the usernames of the customers and their expenditure. And it gave us a list of contents that to add inside the transaction.txt, which is the what we're gonna do first, right? So inside here you can see that there is the John 20.5, Charles 10.5, so on and so forth. However, you can create this using a notepad for Windows people. So you can create a notepad and dump in the same information and save it as a text file. Alright, however on Mac user it's a little different. It is advisable that you can consider creating this text file using your Visual Studio Code, because if you're to use a text editor, there's a chance that you'll create this in the RTF format, rich text format if I'm not wrong, and it will have some unexpected variables and values inside when you're actually using the file. So moving on, after you have created this file, what you will have to do is to understand the rest of the question, right? However, in the question, we talk about user class, which I believe is not taught to you guys yet, and I don't think we'll be ever teaching you guys this. But a class is like an object. But moving on, what you should do is your program should read in the data and put the data in the user class. Each user object is stored in a list with its corresponding total expenditure. For example, when John is detected a second time in the file, which you can see in the file here, and here, alright, the total expenditure should be updated to the existing user. So for example, right, if first time we process John and John is a new user, we will record this user into our database and then you store it there. But let's say if I were to submit John again, I'm supposed to add in this value with this value. So John technically spent $36. Alright, so moving on to the next part. After this is done, the program will provide a simple menu for user to query on the user. Query is usually known as searching, right? And display the total expenditure of the person. So we are supposed to search the person and also display how much they totally spent, okay? And this is done in a loop and would terminate only when user enters -1. So what it says is that you're supposed to have a menu similarly to option 1, option 2, option 3, and so on and so forth. And lastly, you have an exit function which is -1. So let's say if my user enters -1, enter, it will say exit program. Simple as that. Alright, so there are ways to do different to do this question, right? We have the class way, which is what the question is asking, and we also can use a list in a list to do this question. Alright, so how would I do this question is like this, right? So first of all, what I will create is something called user list, and I'll initiate this list, right? Why do I want to initiate this list? Because you want to tell the code that this is going to be a list. And from there, this user list would essentially host information of all the user. So user list will hold multiple users, right? User 1, user 2, user 3, right? Inside this user 1, 2, and 3 has information of the name, which is, let's say for example, John, and also the total transaction, which is 20.5 for the first transaction. And then let's say if John appears another time, we actually just add in the 15.5 with the current 20.5 that the user has. So we're going to use user list to store each individual information inside. And the layout will quite similarly be like this, right? So user list equal to, let's say, I have another array, or I have another list inside that says John and we have the transaction amount of 20.5. Then we have another list. Inside the list that says Charles, right? And then we have 10.5, right? And then we have so and so forth and so and so forth. So that's what essentially we're gonna plan our code to do, right? So user list will hold all the users' information inside, so that there's a place where we can always query the information out from, which is what the question is asking here, right? You need to have a simple menu for user to query on the user and then display the total expenditure. Alright, so now we know that we're gonna store all the users here. We move on to the next step, which is processing of the transaction file. So what we can do is we first define a function called process transaction. Right? It doesn't take in any parameter because it's just plainly processing the same file over and over again. Right? Alright. Pardon me for adding this space in. Alright. So once we have that, the first thing we need to do in reading a file is to create a file path. So we enter file path. We call it transaction.text. Right? Then once we have the file path, we have to make sure that we open the file. So we call it file open the file path, right? Because you have to redirect there. And remember, we have to add in a mode. And in this case, the mode will plainly just be read, which is why we just put R. Alright? Moving on to the next one, we have to then read this file. Alright, so after we open, we are supposed to read it, right? You can't possibly open a wallet and then you don't take out your money to pay your food. So we always have to read the file. So we can store the information of the file inside data by file.readLines. So why do we use read lines, right? So in comparison, read lines read every single sentence or line inside a text file in a list, whereas read reads the whole file as a single text, right? So an example of this would be if I were to do read of the following file, which is John 20.5, Charles 10.5, it will give me a information like this. So data will equal to John 20.5, then they'll give me a new line, and then Charles 10.5, then /n Sharon 10, and then so and so forth. It just gave me one whole string. Instead, we want this to be in a list, right? So we want this to be a list where data can, let's say, 0 equal to John 20.5 /n. We want something like this, and then we can create something that has the other information, like let's say 1 to Charles 1.5. Then we also have Sharon 10, right? We want something like this. We want data to be like this because we are supposed to read every single line individually. So that is the reason why we use read lines instead of read. Okay? So after we are able to actually pass the data over to the data variable, we need to be able to read the data every single line, right? So what we can do, we use a for loop that loops every single item inside this data. So a simple method would say, I want to loop every item in the data. So data has a lot of items, right? Like you know that data is a list, right? Data is a list, right? And I want to read every single item, so I use for item in data. I want to loop each individual item, and once I have the item there, I just need to make sure that item is equal to item.strip. Why we use item.strip is because we have this information right here, right? And we don't want the /n, because having the /n is something that is not necessary. We don't need the /n. We don't need to have a break line, a new line for us to process the data with. So what we do is we can strip this information, right? So we have to make sure that we strip this first, then we process the data using .split. So columns equal to item.split. Now, when you split, there's different ways of method, right? You can use slash, you can use comma, you could also use space, right? It really depends on how your file is saved in. So let's say in this case, the file is saved with a space, right? You can see the code here as well. It's a space. So we have to delimit this, or rather split this or splice this in a way in the use of space. So every space is considered one value at the left or the right. Okay? And we don't need to define the max value because we want to split everything. Right? If you want to split a certain number, you can go ahead and enter 1 or let's say 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. Up to you. Alright? So once we have an item that is split, we have two variables, which means columns is a list. Right? So whenever you split something and you save that in a variable, this item becomes a list. So if you try to visualize what happens when you're trying to split John 20.5, it will be like this. Columns, the 0 index, which is the first item on that list, is essentially equal to John. Remember, it's a string, so we have to take note of that. And columns 1 is equal to 20.5, right? So this is essentially what columns is currently holding. But after we manage to actually split this all out, and then we can actually identify John, we can identify the transaction amount, what do we do next, right? The next thing we need to do is to create another for loop to run our user list, right? So we need to check whether this user exists. So what we can do, we have another for loop called user, where it loops user list item in user list. So you remember coming back to earlier on when we say that we're going to store the user in this aspect, right? So user list will hold user 1, user 2, and user 3. So every single item in that list, we call it user list item, and then we have the user list that we want to loop through. So after we have that, we can enter, let's say, if user list item 0. Why do we put 0? Because if you see here, this is our structure. We want to store the information in this structure. So if you can see here, the first item in the first array of the user list, right? You see, so this is the whole array, right? And then we have the first item, right? We want to be able to make sure that user list item is equal to this, because it's really looping every single value. This is one value in user list, second value in user list, so on and so forth. And we want to check the first item, which is what the loop is doing already. And then we want to say, hey, I want to check the first value of that information. And we know that the first information that in the user is the name, and the second information would be the transaction amount. So in other words, if user list item equals to name, user list item 1 is equal to transaction amount. Right, sorry, pardon me, let me put this 0 here. So these are the differences, which is why I use 0, because I want to check whether the name exists in our database. So once I have that, I would just simply compare with the information that I'm processing through the text file. And let's say if it's a match, right? You say exists equal to true. Right? Make sure your T is capital, and then I would have something called the index found equal to counter. However, if you realize, However, if you realize why I have this index found, it's mainly because I want to be able to reference the information back to where I am supposed to acquire this information from. So for example, right now that we have a counter here, but you realize I have no counter plus plus or counter plus equal to 1. Well, that's because we haven't exactly finished the loop. So what I'll do here is I'll just plus equal to 1, right? And then I'll create a new few variables, and this variable will actually assist me in identifying whether the criteria are correct. So index found equal to 0, right? So I have a default value that is 0. I have a default value that is false for exists. So if let's say this criteria match, so let's say the item name is the first user is called John, and the information that I'm processing right now is called John as well. It will say that it exists, it will be equal to true, and it will record this index found information down, and I can process it later on, right? Because this is outside the for loop. So once I know this information, I can just simply add something called if. After this particular loop is done, right, then we process counter plus equal to 1. What we can do is that we can do a if else statement to check whether if this exists equal to false, I would simply append my user dot append columns 0 and user dot 1. Then you'll be asking me, why am I adding this user? Like, where this user pops out from? Well, simple, because I haven't actually add this user array. So what we are trying to do is that we are trying to create a user, right? For every a new user, we just use this new user. We initiate a list here, which is why you can see there's list inside a big S list, right? So after we create this, what we need to do is that we need to append. Why do we use append? Because it adds in, right? So we need to append this particular user that we have added the information into our main database, which is the user list. So user list dot append user, right? And this would simply add in the user information into our main user list, right? And then if let's say this doesn't exist, what we can simply do is that we just know that if let's say if the exist is not found, it means there is an existing user. What we do is we can concatenate the user using index found, right? And why do we put 1? Because index found will record the user that exists and where it's located. So let's say if Charles is gonna have 0, it is gonna have 1, right? So Charles is the index 1 of user list. So we know that the user ID is about 1, which is what you call the index found. And then we want to edit the transaction amount. And transaction amount is always the second, which is index number 1 inside this array, inside this list, right? So once we have that, we'll just make sure that we enter a concatenate. So we first change it to a string. Why do we change the string? Because we want to concatenate it as a string instead of an integer. However, when we are dealing with the numbers inside, we actually convert this into a float, which is a decimal point. So user list, alright, you do it this way. List index found. So in reference to the particular user, you want to deal with the particular user's transaction amount, which is why we put it 1. Then we plus another float, we call it, and then we have columns 1, right? Because columns 1 is referring to the transaction amount, right? Okay, so once all this information is done, we just simply file.close. Alright, then we just do a simple print. Alright, let's move this back a little bit because you see this is under the, we are supposed to put this under the function. So we can simply print a very elegant message. Let's say successfully processed transaction file. Then we /n to make it nicer, right? So we break a line, it looks nicer. So this is our first function that we deal with for processing of a transaction file. So the next thing we need to deal with is to search and display the total amount of the user. So first of all, we have to create a function again, right? So search, let's say search display total amount, right? And then why not we pick, we utilize a parameter called username. Why do we use username? Because we are supposed to query on the user, right? So once we query on the user, we can first make sure that we run every single in the user list. So remember, we have this database of users, right? So for user in user list, right? So what we are going through is we're going through every single user, right? Or you could actually call this as user list item as well. So it makes more sense to you guys. Alright, and then for user list item, we want to make sure that we are able to loop every single item so that we can identify whether the user exists in our database. So user list item 0, we are checking the name, right? So this is actually looping this value and then this value. Then by stating that this is the number 0 index, we are stating that we want to get this value or these values. Okay, so user list item must be equal to username, which is very case sensitive in this case because we are not doing any case manipulation here. If this user exists, you just say exists equal to true. And then we'll simply print out the information that we need to. So the total amount, transaction for username, is, let's say we give a $sign to look nice, right? Is user list item 1. Why we put 1, like I said, is because the 1 item is the transaction amount and 0 is the name. So we use the name to search and then we display the value there. So once this is done, we can just simply make it a little bit nicer. We can put a full stop and a break line. However, if this doesn't exist, right? If exists equal to false, what happens? We have to send them a message saying that, hey, this is something that is not available. Can you try again, right? So no such user is found in the system. please try again. Right? There you go. So, however you see, there is no exist value stated beforehand. So there's a chance that there will be an issue. So it's very important that you declare what exists default value is. So let's say the default value is false. So they won't assume that the value is always true. Okay? So it's important that you define, or let's say you initiate a default value for that particular variable that you'll be using to testify to a criteria. Okay? So once we have this, define search display total amount, this function is pretty much done. So we can carry on to the next part of the question, which is, this is done in a loop and would terminate only when the user enters -1. Right? So we highlight this area, tell us that, okay, we need to create a manual that works in a loop. Not necessarily a loop. Yeah, it doesn't have to be a do while loop or a loop. You can just do a loop no matter, without the use of a for loop or a while loop. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this. I'll just define a new function. I'll say get manual. This get manual has the first information, which is printing of the options that the user can enter. So please select the following options using numbers. Right, so we have the first one. Let's say 1 is process transaction file. Right? Then 2, we have search and display users total expenditure. Did I spell correctly? Expenditure, I guess so. Alright. And then lastly, we have -1, right, which is quit. Then we finish with this particular one. Then we have another one which is called print. No, sorry. Instead of that, we have the user input variable that is equal to our user's input. So we can just immediately ask for the input from the user. So please enter option . Right? So this will ask the user for the option. So once we have this information here, we are supposed to have an if-else statement to determine what is the option they select, right? So we can do an if-else statement. I'm pretty sure that you guys have done this similarly before. So if user input is equal to 1, we process transaction, right? Then else if user input is equal to 2, search display total amount. But when we are searching for total amount, all this, we have to be wary that we need to have an input, right? Because you see, search display requires a parameter called username. So what we can do is that we have another input inside here that says, please enter the user's name. Case sensitive. Right? It's just like how you log into your Facebook, your Twitter, Instagram, you need to have a case sensitive password in this case. So once this is done, you'll go to the next one, which is else if user input equal to -1. We will simply print out, thank you for using accounting system, right? Bye bye. And then we initiate a function called quit. So what quit essentially does is that it it terminates the whole program, right? So it's a very quick and easy way to say, hey, close this. But you'll make sure that you print this message out into the terminal first before it quits. However, if let's say I enter 456345, right? Those weirdo kind of inputs. Then we have to make sure that we check this as well. So if any other inputs that this fella enter, you can say invalid option, right? Please try again. Right, so that's about it. And then we just want to make sure that we always go back to the menu again. So we initiate the same function in our function. So it goes back to the same loop over and over again. So this is essentially the functions that we have. And we have another function called search display total amount. We also have a process transaction function. And then we have a user list right? But we lack of one thing. What is the main function that will kickstart this program? We need to have a get menu first. So this is to initiate the first menu function. Alright, so once this is all done, you can give it a try. Let's see, there's an error here. Where's this arrow over here? Let's see. Let's just try run this. Alright, so let me just delete this first and run this again. -1. Go to this one. Did that help? Oh, sorry. We're gonna put the colon over here. Okay, so once this is done, we can run this file. Alright, you can see, please select the following options using numbers. So why don't we try the first wrong option? So 3, say invalid option, please try again. 4, 5, 6. Alright, you can see that. So let's say if I will process my transaction file. Oh, looks like we have an error over here. So let's check what's the error here. See, the error is because there's no such counter initially defined. So what we do here is we could just add in a counter equal to 0. And that should give the counter a default value of 0. So we can run this file again. We'll see if it works. So 1. Right, successfully process your transaction file. Alright, we're gonna check our user, so we're gonna try, let's say John. Right, John spent $54. Okay, was that right? Yeah. I'm gonna try processing this transaction again. So let's check John. So $153. So it works. So let's try again and see if this information is alright. I'm going to process the file once. We search John. See, there's an issue. Right, so 20.5 and 15.5 is supposed to be $36, but we have no idea why this is not working. So, alright, let me debug this and I'll get back to you guys. Right, so earlier on I have a problem with adding the wrong amount to the particular John, right? The user John. So I realized that I have an issue which is over here, right? For user list item in user list, I realized my counter is supposed to be meant for this particular for loop instead of the external for loop. So I actually missed out an indentation to ensure the counter is belonging to user list item. So once I've actually amended this, we can give it a run. Let me delete this away and try it again. So I processed my first transaction. So I can say on the search user John, John has the amount of 36. Right, so let's say we try another one. We check Charles. Right, here's $28.50. Right, you can do some mental calculation. It actually adds up very well. So let's say you want to add multiple transactions. You know, I want to add. Then I try search again, John. Right, here's $180. Right, so it works quite similarly this way. Likewise, if you do a wrong option, you will not accept anything until we press -1, which says thank you very much for using Woohoo accounting. Alright, so that's about it for this particular class. Alright, if there's anything that you're unsure, feel free to email me. Alright, I won't be giving you this code. By all means, you have to consider copying this code from this video that I'm going to be posting on YouTube. Alright, so any questions you can ask me. I'll try to explain this again. I'll briefly go through this question in the next practical session we have. Alright, and you guys can also work on your assignment as soon as you can. However, the important part in this is that we have a get menu, right? And this menu is something that is very crucial to finishing your assignment. Alright, that's about it. Thank you very much. See you in the next practical.